نفهم قبلها من وقفات احتجاجية خلال الأعوام القليلة الماضية ما كان لها أن تتم لولا المساحات العريضة لحرية الرأي والتعبير والصحافة وغيرها من الحريات التي أتاحتها خطوات الإصلاح لأبناء الشعب.
Ladies and gentlemen, after this moving clip from YouTube, I would like us to start this talk with a quote from an Egyptian revolutionist from the year 1919. And that quote says, "If I was not Egyptian, I would have wished to be Egyptian." The name of this person was Mustafa Kemal, and he was a young Egyptian attorney who was one of the leaders of the 1919 revolution that led to the establishment of the first constitution in 1923 in modern Egypt. I'm sure that all nations have similar statements of national pride that are made when nations have achieved historic accomplishments. Fortunately, it's Egypt's turn again to celebrate a historic accomplishment called the Egyptian Revolution. This revolution comes very close to us here, to the members of the Purdue family, because one of us right now, Dr. Assam Sharaf, an alumnus of my department, my school, the School of Civil Engineering, is now leading Egypt through its road to freedom and democracy. Today we are honored to have with us an eyewitness to this historic event, Mr. Ahmed Rehab. Mr. Ahmed Rehab is an Egyptian-American activist born and raised in Chicago. He's the vice chairman for an organization called Refugee One. He also serves as a board member for the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, ICRR, and the Chicago Human Relations Advisory Committee, and the Egyptian American Society. Ahmed was on the ground during the revolution, and he today shares with us his insights of what had been happening and actually what and the future to come. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Ahmed Rehab.
Good evening, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. It is truly a pleasure for me to spend a couple of hours of this evening with you talking about what I consider to be one of the most important historical events of our time. And I don't just say that because I was there, but truly the magnitude and the significance of what happened in Egypt and generally in the Arab world will have repercussions not just for Egypt and the Arab world, but really globally as well. To put things in context, this was not a revolution against a president. This was not a revolution against a regime, meaning the president's government, the last 30 years has been in power. But it goes back to the regime that started in 1952, the military rule of Egypt under Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was of the Free Officer movement that liberated Egypt from the monarchy that used to rule Egypt in a parliamentary system. And so, to me, it spells the beginning of the end of the post-colonial era in the Arab world. So we had the colonial era, and then we had the post-colonial era, which was characterized by Arab nationalism. That was the predominant ideology, the Nasserist Arab socialism. And what we have today is an interesting situation because this was not an ideological revolution. This did not topple an ideological regime in order to replace it with a different ideology, but rather it was a methodological revolution. One that focused on things like social justice, transparency in government, accountability in government, fairness between classes and between genders and between religions. So it really focused on values, human universal values. That was the sort of rallying cry of the people from the very beginning up until this point. Despite the presence of various political groups, as well as apolitical masses in this revolution. And so I call it, because it is not just in Egypt, but also in Tunisia, and we're seeing the seeds of change in other Arab countries as well, I call it pan-Arab humanism. And that is what I consider this new era to spell. There are so many different ways I can talk about my experience in this revolution. I think probably the best way is to start chronologically and to try to give anecdotal pointers as I go along, as well as the larger context, both politically and historically. So I landed in Egypt 3 days before the revolution. And that obviously put a question mark for a lot of people, whether it was coincidental or whether I knew about it. And the fact of the matter is, while I did not let on for security purposes, at no point did any of us believe that this would be a revolution, this would be the revolution that it was. And we hoped it would succeed, but the way it happened, I think none of us could have imagined. And so I had to put the scenario, and that's really what I thought would happen more likely than anything else, of being wounded or hurt or even more likely incarcerated by the notorious Amn al-Dawla, or the state security apparatus in Egypt. But I found out about it from a Facebook page, as did many Egyptians, both in Egypt and around the world. And this page is called We Are All Khalid Said, or Kullina Khalid Said in Arabic. And Khalid Said is a young man from Alexandria, a port in the Mediterranean Sea in the north of Egypt, who about a year ago was picked up from an internet cafe and shoved into the back of a state security semi-truck, taken to jail, tortured, questioned, beaten into a pulp. He died in the process, and he dumped his corpse back where they had picked him up, disfigured and bloody. And even by Egyptian standards at that time, meaning even within the context of the notorious state security police, this was a significant event. This was a hair-raising, chilling event. It wasn't deja vu, it wasn't life as normal, as usual. And so, but in my opinion, the state security and the regime had gotten to a point of complacency that they no longer cared what kind of reaction this got them. So what happened was a group of youth created a Facebook page to commemorate this young man and, moreover, to call for an end to police brutality. And that was really the first demand of the protest that started on January 25th. And when the protests were called for on January 25th and the demands made public, at no point was any of these demands to topple the regime or to remove Mubarak. As a matter of fact, the 5 demands were an end to police brutality, the firing of the Minister of Interior, who is the head of the police in Egypt, the end of emergency martial laws that have been in effect since Mubarak took power after the assassination of Sadat, constitutional reforms, and to rerun the elections in Parliament, which were so heavily rigged that the opposition groups, totaling 17 different opposition groups, only got 3%. And 97% of the parliament was the same party, the ruling Democratic National Party. Again, the complacency and the blatant nature, the dismissive attitude of the government to the people. So, at that point in time, there was about 10,000 people when I joined in late September. At this point, there's more than 1 million fans on this Facebook fan page called We're All Khaled Said. But when the revolution broke out at that point in time, it was protest on January 25th. It had about 80,000 people. So I arrived in Cairo on January 22nd. It seems like centuries ago, because it was such a different time. Everything was still in place as it had been in the 90s, in the year 2000, in the 80s. It was life as usual. There was no clear writing on the wall except for those of us who were talking about it behind the scenes, just to give you an indication of how fast things changed and how much they changed. Mubarak was still in power. Gamal Mubarak, his son, was still the expected, unofficially, but expected nonetheless, heir to the presidency. You had the cronies, surrounding Mubarak, the multi-billionaires. And again, when I talk about a military regime in Egypt that started with Nasser and was continued with Sadat and Mubarak, I must add as well that it further devolved into a financially corrupt regime under Mubarak that was sort of a marriage between political power and big money. And this happened through the influence of his son Gamal as he sort of rose in the political ranks within the Democratic National ruling party. He began to bring in some of his business friends and give them political power. And the sort of corruption, both financial, moral, political, and otherwise, was really part of the fuel, part of the fuel that helped ignite this revolution. So at that point in time, everything was still in place. And we had this Facebook page. Unbeknownst to me, there were some movements in the background by organized youth leaders that went beyond the Facebook fan page. And I learned this later after Mubarak had resigned. And I want to tell you a little bit about that in due time. But at this point in time, I'm leading you chronologically as I saw the events, and as most Egyptians did as well. And so what we saw were the 17 different opposition groups had endorsed the protest on the 25th. They added their name to the Facebook fan page, increasing the profile of this protest as opposed to previous planned protests in the last decade. And they called it the January 25th Revolution. Now, while it was planned before Tunisia gave us hope. It made it seem possible that this time it could be different. So Tunisia did not give the planners of this protest day the idea, but rather the hope. The idea had been there already. And the January 25th date was chosen because it was police day. So it makes perfect sense if you walk through the Khaled Said narrative and the police brutality, and that's what it was at that point in time. In any case, now the ingenuity and really the genius of the youth organizers was key for the success of January 25th. There's nothing novel or groundbreaking about calling for a protest in Egypt. But the fact that you call for one, and you actually achieve the goal of reaching Tahrir Square, which is the central square in downtown Cairo, despite the readiness of the police, despite the organization of the police, was really groundbreaking. And this is how it happened. So they announced on Facebook 20 different locations for people to meet at and basically start the protests at. And these were landmark spots. These were famous streets or street corners or mosques or churches or whatever else. But there was a 21st secret, unplanned, or unannounced location. And the key was to organize a mass of people without announcing to anybody the fact that this would happen. So how do you do it? They basically, and this was a coalition of 5 different youth groups, and I'll talk about them later, but they're called, let's call them the Revolutionary Youth Coalition. And this group basically planned it as follows. They put together 10 groups of 10 individuals each. And only one person in each of these 10 groups knew what was happening. And they dispersed these 10 groups of different slums in the same poor neighborhood within walking distance of Tahrir Square, with the plan that they would march individually through different paths to pour into the same small square within that, still within the auspices of this poorer neighborhood at the exact same time. And they ran rehearsals, they timed the marches, if they were to walk fast, if they were to walk slow, how would they arrive at that same spot at the same time? They even practiced the chants that work in this neighborhood. So they're not at this point talking about democracy and freedom and revolution, but they're talking about bread, unemployment, police brutality, pride, dignity, the things that mattered to that particular community. And through the rehearsals, they found that these slogans do work. So as each of these 10 groups were marching in their respective paths, chanting the slogans, the practice slogans, indeed people would come and join, they would snowball, and by the time they poured in that central area in front of a sweet shop that was closed for that day, they were in the thousands. Completely with the appearance of spontaneity, but really planned and organized. And by the time then, they were in the thousands, marching still in that neighborhood, not yet at the main street. It was a sight to behold, enough to encourage more people to join. Something was going on. It's safer than we think. This is real. And so more and more people joined, and they were in the tens of thousands by the time they reached the main street. And it was only at that point that the police got note that something was going on. There was a 21st location. They tried to basically dispatch some military riot police, or rather riot police, and it was too little too late. That was the only group that day that broke through the police cordon and reached Tahrir Square. Every other group, predictably, had been surrounded, isolated, beaten up, and dispersed. I had been in one of those 20 groups that were beaten up and dispersed, and I had to go home, and I thought that nobody would reach Tahrir Square, and then only to find out that, indeed, we had made it to Tahrir Square. Now that was relevant in the sense that it broke the ice for the first time ever. The people were able to storm into Tahrir Square. Now, the police obviously at that point regrouped, came in with large numbers. They had their water hoses, their tear gas bombs, the rubber bullets, and they dispersed the crowd by midnight. But still, the point had been made. At that point, I had gotten home at around 7 p.m., so I decided to take a group of friends. I had been on my own earlier in the day, and to just walk around the Tahrir Square vicinity looking for any group of people to join, any riot or any movement, any action basically. And we found a group of about 3,000 people in this poor area called Sabteya, and we marched and we chanted until we were again attacked by the police and had to go home. Now at that point in time, the regime shut down Facebook, they shut down the internet, they shut down mobile phones, and they even got to a point of shutting down landlines. So there was absolutely no way of communication between any two people in the country that were trying to do communication via distance or any mass communication of any sort. So we're sitting here Wednesday and Thursday. There were some movements in some parts of Cairo, but nothing significant. And the town of Suez, by the Suez Gulf, by the Suez Canal, also had sort of erupted. But again, we couldn't tell, had this movement been subdued or was there still a chance that we can do something? Because we knew there was the Friday of Rage planned for that Friday, the day of Rage. And what's significant about Friday is that for Muslims it's the Sabbath. It's basically the day in which the holy prayer is held en masse, large congregations in the various mosques around the country. And so we sat there on this Thursday night with my friends in my apartment in Heliopolis, a suburb of Cairo, and we began to deliberate. Do you think, we said to each other, that something is going to happen tomorrow, January the 28th? Do you think we could be back in the streets to Tahrir Square? Or have people been, pretty much dismayed and demoralized? So a friend of ours said, if anything is going to happen, it is probably going to be at this one mosque called Mustafa Mahmoud Mosque in this area called the Muhandisin, which was actually quite far from me. So we decided to go there, again looking for action. So the next day we got into a cab, drove for about an hour, had the cab driver drop us off at a distance because we didn't want the secret police to see us coming out of the cab into a mosque. There's a mosque at every corner, so clearly if you're cabbing into a mosque, you're up to something. And then we walked into the mosque as if we lived in this neighborhood. Sure enough, there were the battalions of the riot police with the helmets that you saw and the sticks and everything else, and the intimidating large blue trucks with more soldiers in there. We walked into the overflow section of the mosque, sat under the fluttering leaves of a tree, sort of the quiet that preceded the storm, and listened to the sermon. And we looked around, just kind of eyeballed the crowd, and I had talked to a few of the firebrands in my group, and I told them, listen, I don't want you guys chanting right after prayer and be the first ones to do so, and then nobody else does it, and we're the guys that are taken by the scruff of the neck and thrown in the back of the car, in the police car, and it's done. Let's take a couple of minutes to kind of see how things are going, survey the scene, and as things pick up, then we join sort of intelligently. Let's not jump the gun here. So we're there before the prayer, eyeballing the crowd. There were a few guys with some signs and girls, but the people that were praying looked like they were just everyday people praying. And so it occurred to me, the scenarios, the possible potential options, is that the prayer would end and the peddlers selling lemon or fruit or whatever else would start their calling for the lemon and for the melons and for whatever else, and people would pick up their paper and just kind of, lazily walk to their homes or whatever. Or that a small group of activists would try to create a scene and nobody would join them and they'd be, picked up and taken away, and we'd be amongst them or not. Or that something else could happen. So the sermon that was being given by the imam, the leader of the prayer, actually addressed the situation. That's how tense it was. And he said, I recognize that what is going on in the country right now is significant. My sons, my daughters. I recognize that the youth have legitimate demands. And then everybody started to applaud in that mosque. And if you know anything about Muslim prayer, that's extremely unusual. In all of my life of attending Muslim prayers on Fridays, I've never heard an applause in a mosque. So it was an indication that this crowd perhaps had something brewing. And then he said, and that this was the line given to him by the government, because every mosque was controlled by the Ministry of Religion, which is a government apparatus. And he said, but at the same time, I don't want you to rush into anything. Islam teaches us to be in control, to not act in fury, right? To be calm and to have dialogue. So let's not, walk in the streets, let's not create chaos, etc., etc. At that point, nobody gave him any reaction, it was completely quiet. So anyway, the prayer started, I was going through the prayer. At this point, my mind is racing, what's going to happen after the prayer. And towards the end, as he said the last couple of prayers in that prayer, the shahada as we say, he's on one end he goes, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and then he ends by saying the same thing on the other side, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And as soon as before he was even done, one guy just jumped up in the air, Yaskut, Hosni Mubarak, down with Hosni Mubarak. And before I had finished the thought in my mind that this guy was brave but nutty because he was the only guy that was doing it, everybody in that mosque chanted the same thing. In this exact same breath. Everybody had come to that mosque with the same thought that we had in our minds, which is, we're ready. We don't know what's going to happen, but we're ready. If somebody starts it, we're ready to go. And as it so happened, every mosque in Cairo had the same scenario and the same experience, and every mosque in the country as well. And so, history had it that January 28th, while January 25th was the start of the revolution, that's the date that you hear about, because it broke the ice in the way that I explained, January 28th, the day of rage, was the real thing. That was the day that millions took to the streets and claimed back their country. And it happened spontaneously in that respect, that everybody had it inside of them. And all they wanted was just a spark. And obviously the same youth groups that were organizing had also organized marching routes, but it was much bigger than that at that point. It was a populist movement. And so from that point on, the only experience I had ever had up until that moment protesting in Egypt was in Al-Azhar mosque, the seat of Sunni Islam, one of the oldest mosques, in fact the oldest university in the world. And this was 2 years ago, at around the time that Gaza was being cut off by Egypt during the Israeli siege. And we protested inside the courtyard of the mosque, and when we tried to come out, the police kind of beat us, inwards, and we couldn't leave. We protested all we wanted in a little bubble, but we couldn't go outside. That's how, nefarious and ruthless the police was. So that was the only experience that I had in my mind. At that point in time, we're still within the vicinity of the mosque. I see the soldiers marching in single file around the mosque, circumventing it, and I thought it's going to be the same thing. But lo and behold again, we turn around, we're at the end of the mosque, we turn around now on the first row, facing the police, the right police, and guys from behind me and around me, start pushing. So I push with them. And, if Egyptian culture, it's hard to explain, but it's flowery. It uses nice words and, smiles and pats on the back, and even in tense situations like this, the young men were like, you're our brothers. You guys, you're in uniform, we're not. It's the same country, it's the same cause, we're doing this for you. And it was heartfelt, and it was sincere and genuine. But it was interesting to see. I think it's something very unique to Egypt, that in a situation like this, that's the kind of discourse you would hear. And so, the right police just kind of looked at each other, and they tried to stop us, but we were too many, so they kind of, gave up. And that was the first moment that day that I felt, wow, something is going to happen. And now we're in the public square. We're outside, we're free, we're in the streets. We're not in the mosque anymore. This was the first time it ever happened, or anybody that was there, apart from the 25th. And the people that were outside going around about their business looked at us and just realized this explosion of people into the square. This was, again, the very beginning of everything that you saw, the very beginning of it. And they joined us. And we started to march down Main Street in Mohandesin area, which is sort of an upper-class area with high-rises on both sides. There were no cars in the streets. The police continued to march in single file on the sidewalk as we filled the streets, both this way and that way, the two-way streets. And as we marched, people joined us, and from the thousands, we became, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, still marching down the main street. And when we would spot somebody up in the balconies or, in any of the buildings that was looking down, everybody would stop their chants, look up and point at them and say, "Inzil ya Masri, calm down Egyptian." And obviously the guy would have all the attention on him, and he'd either join us or go right back in. But it was interesting to see the interaction, how personalized. This mass movement was personalized. And at that point in time, it was a happy movement. People were smiling, they were looking at each other with hope and happiness. There were young children, there were the elderly. I saw a guy in a wheelchair, a woman with a stick, kind of like, limping along with two people holding her. The small canteens on the way, the small shops would give us water for free and food and biscuits, and everybody was cooperating. It was a happy time. We kept on walking and marching, from one street to another until we got to the first major square called El Galat Square, which, if you imagine the map, it's basically this square, and then there's a bridge, that's the first bridge, there's an island on the Nile, the second bridge, and then there's Tahrir Square. So right when we get up to the top of the beginning of this Galat Square, we realize, wait a second, the bridge just across the square, the first bridge, it's filled with riot police. And before you could realize that, boom, 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 you start to see clouds of smoke, and they were firing tear gas canisters at us at a ridiculous rate. Rubber bullets, the whole 9 yards. So everybody kind of backed up. You know, I look behind me at this point, God knows it was 50,000, 60,000 people. Again, just a tremendous sight. And I want you to understand the sort of stability, more or less, that the Egyptians had for so many years. This was not a normal sight. You don't see 2,000, 3,000 people easily in the street in Egypt without, massive police presence. But here you had, until the very end of the horizon, it was filled with people. You knew it was a historic day. So some of the children, obviously, some of the families with kids, some of the elderly, those that saw that it was a dangerous situation began to leave, and we were left with those who felt fit enough to handle a combative situation. The first tear gas bomb that I experienced will forever be part of my memory, will never part with me. We were standing by the gas station at the very top of the street, and all of a sudden it just hit me. And that was the first time I really experienced it. And mind you, these were expired, so I don't know if this is a normal thing or because it was expired, but it was very intense. It's difficult to explain the feeling. Basically, your eyes really itch, your ears, your nose, your throat, you're coughing uncontrollably. You more or less lose control of your senses. And the only way you can deal with it is just to squat down in a corner and hope that it goes away. 5 minutes, just hope for the effects to go away. There's nothing else you can do. Completely debilitating. So we did that. We ran into the gas station, and kind of, as we began to, as the effects began to leave us, somebody kind of filmed us, and that's maybe one of the clips I'll show you. And then we came right back into the square. And we're sitting there looking at this massive presence of police. And then again, something you would see for the rest of that day, there was always a group of people that were leaders, just natural leaders. They're not organizers, they're just people like me and you. We gotta go, let's go, we gotta break through. And everybody's like, well, can't you see how many there are? There's so many of them. We're not gonna sit here, we're down in the streets, this is it. We're not going back home. Let's go. And he starts running. At first, it's just 10 guys running kind of, all over the place. They get beaten up. They're bloodied. Some of them don't move. Some of them move. They're pulled back. People are shouting. People are crying out. It's a very intense scene. And then everybody starts running. It's always that first row of people that kind of break the ice. And I saw it more than once. And these, to me, are the real heroes of that street, the street part of the revolution. It could not have been done without them, without their sacrifice. And there were scenes of people just running at a battalion of police and just, flinging themselves at them with no weapons, and you could see the battalion with all sorts of weapons. And, you could see photos and footage of that. In any case, after push and shove, we were able to claim part of the bridge, and then they pushed back at us, they got the bridge again, we went back and got the bridge again, so it was push and shove until we had that first bridge. And at that point in time, you're marching over the bridge with these large number of people, and the Nile is right there, and blue skies, and you're thinking to yourself, where have I seen this before? It kind of reminded me of scenes I had seen of the early youth riots during the colonial period, when the Egyptians were trying to reclaim their freedom from a foreign monarchy. And these were iconic scenes, and they were repeated once again, but with larger numbers, and with a stronger historical context. Right at that point, the azan, or the call for prayer, broke through the air, and everybody just stopped and decided to pray. And so we did, in files and ranks, and we began to pray. And at that point in time, the Christians amongst us stood in a circle to protect us from the police. And after we were finished, we asked them to hold a prayer, and then we surrounded them to protect them. And at that point, the police had stopped firing until we finished prayer, and then boom, they started firing again. At a later point in the day, at another bridge, and again, that's one of the famous scenes of the revolution, they were actually still pouring water on people as they were praying, but the people did not stop. They continued to pray. We're marching down that bridge, and there's nowhere to go, so as you're seeing the tear gas canisters being lobbed right into the middle of your crowd, and you always see them followed by a wave of cloud of smoke, the only thing you can do is just to kind of try to run to the left or to the right or so, but there were always people, again, that had the presence of mind to pick it up and chuck it into the Nile, into the water. So from where I was standing, I could see sort of the cloud, the smoke of cloud, go into a trajectory into the crowd. I'd count to 2 or 3, boom, it'd go into a trajectory into the sea, either to the left or to the right. And there were always these quick guys that would pick it up and just shove it right back into the sea. For a while, they weren't able. Well, there was about a 20-minute period where the tear gas bombs were actually going to the left and to the right, falling into the sea without us having to throw them there. And I thought to myself, this has to be an officer of conscience. Because it wasn't, it could not have been a coincidence. It was to the left, then to the right. To the left, then to the right. For about 20 minutes, not one was on the bridge. Then apparently his commander found that out and took him out, because the next guy, who was right smack in the middle every single time. So we crossed that first bridge, and at that point in time, they brought larger reinforcements, and I was with a group of people that got stuck in the middle in that island. Everybody retreated, and about 200 of us were left in that island, sort of running around, trying to find a way out. We went to the other direction, there was more police, there was a lot of casualties within that group of ours. We would carry them, ask for, is anybody a doctor? Can anybody take care of this guy? Can we get an ambulance? And ambulances would be few and far between because of the blocked roads and the military and the police and everything else. And at that point, that was one of the low points for me. I felt like, where did everybody go? We were in the tens of thousands. I thought we were 100,000. Where is everybody? So that lasted for about 3 hours, and we had with us actually, just by chance, one of the famous actors who was in the street marching with the people. His name is Khaled Al-Sawi. He was an actor in the famous film, The Jacobian Building. And he was just like everybody else. We all had our face masks, our vinegar bottles, and our Coke bottles. The vinegar, you'd wash out your eyes from the tear gas. We came prepared because of our Tunisian brothers who had sent us text messages telling us what to do. And the Coke bottles you'd wash your face with when you get hit with the tear gas. There was no solution for the rubber bullets or the shrapnel except first aid. And they also told us, if you find one of the police trucks, basically paint the windows in black. That will completely disable their movement because it's very difficult to get the paint off of the screen. So that all these revolutionaries were sharing all of these tips, and now we're sending them to Libya and everything else we learned. So basically, and I don't know how they got my phone number. I'd be just going down the elevator, getting ready to go to Tahrir, and get all these random text messages from Tunis. So at that point in time, 3 hours later, we're walking back to the point that we had been dispersed from, and then lo and behold, we look across the bridge that we had crossed, where we had been, the area where we were stuck, and there was these massive reinforcements. We're talking hundreds of thousands now, not tens of thousands. And apparently what had happened was the same thing we had done, others were doing, only they were farther away. So they were coming from the Giza, from the pyramids area. And they still looked refreshed and showered, and they hadn't been in any, we were battered and tattered, and so this reinforcement came, they had the nicer, bigger signs, and that was just a sigh of relief, the feeling of, it's still happening, we're still on. And they were coming, they were singing patriotic songs, they were chanting, and throughout the whole time, people would chant Silmiya, Silmiya, which means peacefully, peacefully, and this was really a headline of this revolution. That's part of what makes it so great. Despite the brutality that we were seeing from the police, people were committed to that, and they would only fight back when they absolutely had to. So now we're crossing, before we get to the second bridge, there's this road, and both sides of it there are fences. On one end there's a hospital, or rather a mosque and a clinic. On the other end, other side there's a park, and this park is sort of in a depressed, we're in an elevated part of the setting here. So, we're marching, and now we're really filling this area up, and there's nowhere to go except for forward, which is where the police is now congregating, waiting for us to try to cross that last bridge before Tahrir Square. And everything's quiet, they're not firing at us, they're just looking at that point, freaking out. These huge numbers coming at them, singing and chanting. There are no flags at this point, it's just the signs. And so it occurs to me that what happens if, they decide to start firing tear gas or rubber bullets into the crowd again? There's absolutely nowhere to go. So I call a couple of guys. I'm like, listen, we've got to break part of that fence down that leads into the garden. And so we, grab the large green iron fence, and we start shaking it as hard as we can, and we basically rip it off with the concrete part that it was sort of slabbed in. And as this happens, it actually almost falls on my skull, and they kind of hold it. And as we're doing this, everybody's like, Silmi, what are you guys doing? Peacefully, you're ruining this. We're not supposed to ruin anything. You're not supposed to vandalize anything. And I tell the couple, just keep on going. We got to open up. So we open up and we take whatever abuse is being, yelled at us, and we jump into that garden, which it's like almost a story down. It's actually pretty far. And then, we see that there had been an earlier battle there. There's still the smoke clearing, and, people walking kind of, with some blood, and they're sweating. They had driven the police out of that garden. And so we sit and rest there, and no sooner have we, 15 minutes later, sure enough, they start firing tear gas canisters into that crowd. And that opening that we had made, it was like a faucet of people. People were just jumping into the garden, trying to escape the smoke and avoid a stampede. And that was the single moment where I felt my presence had made a difference. Everything else I was happy to be able to do, but I felt like, it could have been anybody. But this was one of those moments where I felt, I'm glad I was here, I contributed something. That was a great feeling. And from that point on, we exited the main garden, regrouped with the main street, and then pushed all just as one, ran right into the police. Those who got beat, those who got shot. So one guy who was next to me got 35 shrapnels into one foot. It was like a sieve. There were so many holes in it, and it was just all bloodied. And again, they pushed at us. There was a semi-stampede. This was probably the worst moment of the day for me, because truly it was like just nowhere to go, and everybody was pushing and yelling. And we managed to kind of escape and go into a side street next to the Ministry of Interior, which is the castle, the home, the home base of all these soldiers. It's basically police, central police department. And that was one of the bloodiest battles that night, because they even had snipers up on the roof. Where they were fighting there, the police, for them it wasn't just a question of sequestering the protesters or dispersing them. This was a question of survival for them. They had nowhere else to go, so they were going to fight, and they were going to fight with everything they had. Yet still, you had some of these guys who were willing to go all out, and some would take off their shirts, douse them in gasoline, run into the police cars, shove them in there, light them up, run back, and the cars would explode. I mean, it got brutal at that point, and there was fire everywhere, and explosions and everything else, and again, they were shooting at us, people would fall. But that was a central battle in the sense that it helped pull away from the central forces that then opened the way for the other guys to get into Tahrir Square. So once we felt that this had been accomplished and we got word that they're breaking in, they're getting into Tahrir, we ran right with them. And that was the most memorable moment of the evening for me, of this long 6 hours, 7 hours fighting and running, and trying to avoid all of these bullets and bombs and everything else. We walked in, it didn't look like Egypt. I mean, it was a scene out of the Iraq War, or, this urban warfare in Gaza or wherever else. Just fire everywhere, smoke, people, banging on metal. But there were high fives, and there were cheers, and there were hugs, and, we had claimed Tahrir Square. And so, at that point, everything we had been doing, we thought we were just doing it alone. There were Egyptians, civilians, just like us, doing it from the other side. And they had been pushing into Tahrir from the other side. And some of these guys, they came prepared. I mean, these included the organized football hooligan clubs. So this was the Ahli Ultras and the Zamalek White Knights, who were arch enemies. I mean, these guys lived to beat up each other. They were united that day. They came together in the hundreds with their Molotov cocktails, their rocks, their slings, everything. They climb up on buildings, start, attacking the police cars, come down, claim the cars, start driving them. They'd have a little code so that this is being driven by one of the hooligans, it's not being driven. But they weren't hooligans that night, they were freedom fighters. It was just a very interesting transformation. Everybody put what they had into that day to claim the streets back for the people. Now, at the end of the day, we decided to go home. There was a little debate in my group, and again, it's short-sightedness. Some of the guys said, you know what, I don't want to leave this place. I want to savor in the historic moment. And my response was just as naive. Don't worry, it's going to last at least a few hours. We'll come back later in the night. So we decided to go home and listen to the president's first address, which was a complete disappointment. He didn't resign as we thought he would, which was the normal and natural thing to do. He just decided to change his cabinet, which meant nothing to us. And so, as a response, those who were left in Tahrir decided to do the vigil, the sit-in. And indeed he did. And that's where the Tahrir movement grew out of. And it wasn't really that large. It was about 5 to 10,000, maybe 15,000, up until the second speech that the president gave a few days later. And in that speech, the president he tried to be emotional. He tried to reach out to the people. He talked about, I'm an Egyptian just like you. I'm a man of peace, a man of war. I gave up my life for this country. I live here, I will die here, etc., etc. And that seemed to have affected a lot of people, especially those who weren't involved in the street movements. Not because they liked him or endorsed him politically, but because of, again, one of the Egyptian values of respect for the icons that represent Egypt, even if you disagree with them. And since he had said that he's leaving in September, and that his son will not run for president, which were one of the two main concessions, they felt like, all right, we're done. Why are you guys still staying in Tahrir Square? You're being spoiled. You're asking for too much. The man did all he could. He doesn't, we don't want to humiliate him. And so there was sort of a division between the people. Those who were like, well, wait, no, we do want to humiliate him. He's been humiliating us for 30 years. The guy's, is a thief, is a bigot, is corrupt, is everything else. And those who were like, well, he's leaving, let's just not embarrass ourselves globally and humiliate our icon, whatever. So we felt like we were losing the revolution. But, God is the best of planners. A few of the leaders, close friends of Gamal in the group of cronies around Mubarak, decided to help him by reclaiming Tahrir from the protesters. So they hatched up a plan where they called up some well-known thugs to them that they had dealt with before, because they always used thugs at every election, every voting booth. They would hire these thugs and have them intimidate the people so that there would be no real voting. So they rounded these guys up, brought them, and sent them into Tahrir Square as just the people. There was anti-Mubarak, there's pro-Mubarak, they're going to fight with each other, it's the people versus the people, we can't do anything about it. We know who's going to win, they thought, the thugs, the ones who came with weapons, the brutal group, and the civilians are not going to be able to do anything, and that'll be it. We'd get a little heat, it'd be blood, but it'd be over. But it happened completely differently. It happened in full view of the world. This was the camel incident. I don't know if any of you guys watched this on television.